$6. That was the number Mark repeated to the cashier while I stood frozen at the register in Whole Foods, my organic strawberries already scanned. He smiled at her like they were sharing a private joke. "My wife just doesn't understand a family budget," he said. The cashier smiled back, uncomfortable, glancing at me for half a second. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that saying nothing cost less than saying something. Mark paid with a folded paper coupon from his old leather wallet, the same wallet he'd carried since college. He liked people to see it. He liked them to see the careful man, the responsible one, the husband who tracked every purchase through the shared app on our phones. Every receipt went into that app. Every charge got a note. $6 for strawberries needed an explanation. $200 for his craft beer nights with clients got filed under business meetings, and nobody ever asked him to explain that line. We drove home in silence, the strawberries sweating in a plastic bag between my feet. Mark talked about his upcoming trip to Chicago, about a client dinner, about numbers that mattered more than mine. I watched the streetlights slide across the windshield and thought about the tea tin on the top shelf of our kitchen cabinet. Nobody else knew what was inside it. 3 years ago, I had started a game Mark didn't know we were playing, and tonight didn't feel like the night to end it. At home, he laid the receipt flat on the counter and photographed it for the app, the way he photographed every receipt, lining the edges up square with the counter tile. He asked if I understood now why we needed a system. I said I understood. That was usually enough to end it, and it did. Our house sat on a quiet street in Austin, brick and ivy, the kind of house people photographed for anniversary cards. Inside, everything looked balanced. Mark believed in balance the way other men believe in scripture. He believed I was the variable that needed correcting, and he corrected me often, always gently, always in front of someone. 2 weeks later, it happened again at his mother's dinner table, over a different number. I'd bought flowers for the centerpiece, $12 from the corner stand near the office where Elena worked. Mark mentioned it between the salad course and the roast, framing it as a funny little story about his impulsive wife. Linda said nothing, though her eyes moved toward me for a moment. I passed the bread basket and let the story pass with it. A month after that came his company's holiday party, in a rented hall downtown with a string quartet and too much shrimp. Mark introduced me to his boss as the one who keeps him humble on groceries. His boss kept checking his watch through the whole exchange, as if the joke were costing him something he'd rather spend elsewhere, then laughed politely and moved on to someone easier to talk to. I stood by the shrimp table holding a glass of wine I didn't finish, counting the minutes until we could leave without it looking strange. Mark never noticed I'd stopped laughing at that particular joke months earlier. He only noticed that I still stood beside him when he needed an audience. Driving home from that party, he complained the whole way about a coworker's bonus, certain he deserved more than he'd been given. He didn't ask once how I'd enjoyed my evening, standing alone by a shrimp table while he worked the room. I looked out the window at the holiday lights strung along the highway overpass and thought, quietly, that I was tired of being furniture at my own life's events. That belief of his had a shelf life, though neither of us knew it yet. There was an earlier warning I should have paid attention to, months before any of this. A check I'd written for my sister's birthday gift bounced because Mark had quietly moved funds between our accounts without telling me, calling it a temporary fix for a bill he'd forgotten. He apologized for the inconvenience, not for the decision itself. He never once considered asking me first. I remember standing in the bank lobby, embarrassed in front of a teller who didn't care either way, and thinking that a marriage shouldn't feel like waiting for permission to spend my own name. That night I lay awake doing math I'd never done before, adding up every dollar I'd earned before we married against every dollar I'd been allowed to touch since. The numbers didn't add up in any direction that made sense for a marriage built on trust. I didn't tell Mark what I was thinking. I let him sleep, and I kept thinking. By the time morning came, I'd stopped asking myself whether I deserved better than this. I'd started asking, quietly, how I would actually get there. The trigger came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the strawberries. Mark had already left for Chicago, his suitcase packed the way he packed everything, symmetrical and labeled by day. He'd left his old tablet on the kitchen counter, the screen still awake from checking email before his flight, because he'd been running late and skipped his usual habit of locking it down. I wasn't looking for anything. I was reaching past it for the coffee filters when the screen lit up with a notification from Chase. The balance stopped me cold. $41,000, sitting in an account I had never seen, never signed for, never heard mentioned in 5 years of marriage. The label under it read Sunridge Holdings. I stood there with the coffee filters still in my hand, staring at a name that meant nothing to me and a number that meant everything. I tapped the notification before I could think better of it, because his screen still showed his last unlocked session from the airport gate. The banking app never fully closed behind him in his rush. The statement opened easily. Transfers went back 2 full years, always described as shared investments and taxes, the same words he'd used against me 100 times when I asked where our savings had gone. He'd called me careless. He'd called me the reason we couldn't get ahead, the reason his retirement plan kept slipping. Behind the tablet sat half a loaf of stale bread, the same bread we'd been rationing all month because groceries were tight, he said, because we needed to watch every dollar together. I looked at the bread. I looked at the screen. I didn't cry, and I didn't call him in Chicago. I closed the tablet exactly the way I'd found it and went back to making coffee like nothing in my life had just rearranged itself. I scrolled once more before I closed it, memorizing the account number the way you memorize a phone number you'll need later. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me more than the number did. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and drank it slowly, the way I always had, while a stranger's name for our future sat glowing 2 feet away. That was the morning I decided silence could be a strategy instead of a wound. I didn't confront him when he came home from Chicago smelling like airport coffee and a hotel he wouldn't name. I asked about his flight instead. I asked if the client dinner went well. He talked, I listened, and somewhere underneath the listening I was already building something he couldn't see. 3 years is a long time to build a door quietly enough that nobody hears the hinges. The first piece was Elena. We'd known each other since college, long before Mark, long before the app that tracked my strawberries. She ran a small marketing agency 2 exits from our house, and she'd been asking me for a year to come design for her part-time. I always used to say I was too busy. That spring I finally said yes. She showed up to our first coffee with a thermos of ginger tea, the same one she always carried everywhere, and the whole cafe smelled faintly of cinnamon when she opened it. She didn't ask why I suddenly had time. She just handed me a laptop and a client brief and let me work. The job paid modestly at first, small checks that never touched our shared accounts, because Elena ran payroll through a separate small business platform Mark had no reason to monitor. He'd never once asked about her agency, since in his mind a part-time design job wasn't real income worth tracking. I opened an account under my maiden name at a credit union across town, the kind of quiet institution that doesn't send alerts to a spouse's phone. Nobody flagged it. Nobody needed to. It was mine and mine alone, built one modest deposit at a time. Elena never asked questions either. Once, folding a check into my hand across her desk, she said only that some things a woman builds quietly, and some things she builds loud, and both were allowed. I kept that thought and didn't ask her to say it twice. Mark noticed the calm before he noticed anything else. I stopped arguing about the $6 charges. I stopped defending the grocery bill line by line the way I used to. He'd expected resistance, and resistance was the thing he knew how to manage. Silence made him anxious in a way he couldn't name, so he watched me more closely, and I gave him nothing worth watching. He asked once, almost gently, if I was feeling all right, since I'd stopped fighting him on the numbers. I told him I was tired of fighting over pennies. He accepted that answer because it flattered him, and he never asked again. There was one close call, in the 2nd year. Mark came home early and found a folder of townhouse listings on the kitchen table, printed from a real estate site for a client project Elena had asked me to mock up. He flipped through the pages and asked why I was looking at property. I told him it was mood board research for a client's rental brand, and I showed him the fake brief Elena had drafted just in case. He believed it because he wanted a reason to stop asking, not because the story was airtight. I moved the real folder into my car that same night and never brought paperwork home again. Every dollar Elena paid me went first into groceries I bought with cash, unlogged, invisible to the app that ruled our kitchen. What was left went into the credit union account, then slowly into a fund my lawyer, a careful woman named Patricia, used to secure financing on a small townhouse in the suburbs. Patricia kept a chipped ceramic mug of cold coffee on her desk through every meeting we ever had, never once drinking from it, never once replacing it either. She filed everything under my maiden name, since money that never touched our joint accounts could stay legally mine alone. The closing took 4 quiet months. I signed the final papers alone on a Thursday afternoon, my hand steadier than I expected, while Mark believed I was at a routine dentist appointment. I kept the mailbox key for that townhouse inside an empty tea tin on the highest shelf of our kitchen cabinet. Mark was tall, but he never reached that high because he kept his own things at eye level and assumed everyone else did too. The tin sat behind an old bag of flour nobody used anymore. It became the quietest place in the house and the safest. Some nights I drove past the townhouse just to look at it from the street, a small brick box with nobody living in it yet, waiting for me the way nothing in my marriage ever had. I never went inside those nights. I just liked knowing the door was mine. On weekends, when Mark played golf with his father, I drove out with a single box of paint samples and picked colors for rooms no one else would ever walk through with an opinion. Sage green for the kitchen. Nothing he would have chosen. By the 3rd year, I had a second income he didn't know about, a house he'd never seen, and a bank account that answered to nobody's app. Mark, meanwhile, kept building Sunridge Holdings, moving money out of what he called our shared future and into something that was never meant to be shared at all. He grew careless the way people do when they think they've already won. He left the tablet unlocked twice more over those months. I never touched it again after the first time. I didn't need to. I already had everything the number could tell me. Once he mentioned Sunridge by accident, on the phone with someone I couldn't place, laughing about numbers that would surprise people someday. I stirred the pasta on the stove and said nothing, because someday was already mine to schedule, not his. That winter Elena's new client asked for me by name on a follow-up email, not Elena. Driving home that afternoon, I realized nobody in that room had once asked me to explain a receipt. Mark's anxiety sharpened as the seasons turned. He started checking the mileage on my car, then leaving his tablet locked in the glove box instead of the kitchen, then asking me twice that fall if I'd been talking to a lawyer, phrasing it like a joke while watching my face too closely for it to really be one. I laughed it off every time and gave him nothing to argue with. By then it no longer mattered what he suspected. The deed was already signed, and the only thing left unfinished was the moment he'd find out in front of people who mattered to him. Rachel, my closest friend from the neighborhood, was the only person who ever asked me directly if I was all right. She always kicked her shoes off the second she sat down anywhere, porch steps included, like comfort mattered more than appearances. That evening she asked why I seemed different lately, lighter somehow, like I was carrying something instead of being crushed by it. I told her only that I was figuring some things out. She didn't push. She just squeezed my hand and said whatever it was, she hoped it worked out for me, and I believed she meant it. I spent one Saturday alone at the townhouse, setting a kettle and a lamp with a soft yellow shade on the empty counter, the shade a color Mark would never have chosen. I sat on the bare floor drinking tea and felt, for the first time in years, like the air in a room belonged to me. By the time the 3rd year closed, I no longer flinched when Mark opened the app at dinner. I watched him scroll through my grocery charges the way you watch weather on a television across the room, present but no longer touching you. He mistook my stillness for surrender. It was the opposite. It was the last quiet stretch before the door I'd built finally swung open. Elena's agency grew that year, and so did my role in it, until I was leading design on 3 accounts instead of 1. She offered to make my position full-time on the books, with real benefits attached to my real name. I told her not yet, because a full-time salary would eventually cross paths with tax forms Mark might glimpse during our joint filing every April. She understood immediately and adjusted my pay structure so nothing would surface before I was ready. It cost her some paperwork headaches. She never once complained about it to me. Patricia warned me early on that timing mattered as much as paperwork. Keep it separate, she said, down to the last light bulb. I never once used our shared card for anything connected to the townhouse. I listened to her the way I used to listen to Mark, except this time the listening was making me freer instead of smaller. Our 5th anniversary arrived in October, and Mark wanted it public. He booked County Line, the restaurant on the bluff over the Colorado River, the one with the big screen usually reserved for slideshows at company parties and wedding rehearsals. His parents drove in from Dallas. Our friends filled 2 long tables under string lights strung between the porch posts. Mark stood to give a toast, and somewhere in the middle of thanking everyone for 5 wonderful years, he pulled out his phone. He did what he always did at gatherings like this. He opened the shared budgeting app and read numbers out loud, my numbers, framed as a joke about his patient, penny-pinching wife. The table laughed, the uncertain laugh people give when they're not sure if it's really a joke. His mother, Linda, touched the pearls at her throat the way she always did when she sensed trouble, though she couldn't have said what kind. Mark tapped 2 fingers on the table before every punchline, a habit I'd watched for 5 years without ever asking about it. Somebody's little cousin at the end of the table asked what Sunridge meant, having overheard Mark mention it earlier to his father. Mark laughed it off and said it was nothing, just paperwork, and moved on to the next joke about my strawberries. Our friend Rachel, sitting across from me, caught my eye for just a second, the way you do when a joke stops being funny. I reached into my bag and took out my own tablet. The restaurant staff had already set up an adapter cable for the anniversary slideshow. Mark had requested it earlier that week. The screen sat wired and waiting behind the head table, ready for exactly this kind of moment. I plugged in my tablet instead of the one loaded with vacation photos. Nobody stopped me, because nobody at that table imagined I had anything of my own to project. The Sunridge statement filled the screen first, 2 years of transfers, the label glowing under the restaurant's soft lighting. Then came the notarized deed to my townhouse, my name printed clean at the top of the page. Then came 3 years of income statements from Elena's agency, proof of a life Mark had never once suspected existed beside his own. The room went quiet in a way October evenings rarely go quiet. Linda's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the tile, a thin red stain spreading toward Mark's shoes before anyone moved to clean it. Mark grabbed for his phone, jabbing at the screen with shaking fingers, trying to lock an app that had already told the whole table everything it needed to know. His mother stared at him instead of me for the first time in 5 years of dinners. Our friends looked at him too, and none of them looked away this time. His father asked, in a voice gone very quiet, what exactly Sunridge was, and Mark had no answer that fit inside a toast. He tried anyway, stammering something about investments he'd been meaning to explain, about surprises meant for later. Nobody at that table believed him, not even the friends who had laughed at his jokes 10 minutes earlier. Mark turned to me and asked, low and furious, what exactly I thought I was doing in front of his entire family. I told him I was doing the same thing he did every dinner, showing everyone the numbers that mattered. He reached for the tablet to unplug it, and the adapter cord pulled taut without coming free, the screen still glowing behind him for one more long second. Rachel's husband quietly took a photo of the deed on the screen before Mark managed to yank the cord loose, though by then every phone at the table had already caught something. Linda stood, dabbing at the wine on her dress, and asked her son in a voice that cracked halfway through the question how long this Sunridge account had existed. Mark didn't answer her either. Rachel reached across the table and took my hand under the tablecloth, the way she used to squeeze it on her porch, and this time she didn't say anything at all. I didn't raise my voice once through any of it. I didn't need to, because the numbers had already said what I never could find the words for. I drove home that night while Mark stayed behind to manage his parents and our stunned friends, the kind of damage control he was good at. I packed one suitcase, only the essentials, and left the rest exactly where it stood. I didn't take his things. I didn't need his things anymore, and I didn't need an apology either. He came home near midnight and found the front door locked, his key no longer working in it because Patricia had already filed paperwork that morning, converting the townhouse deed overnight into full legal separation of our shared property. He pounded on the door and got no answer, then tried my phone and got no answer either. He called twice more before dawn, then a third time, and I let each call ring out on the counter beside my new front door. By morning, he was standing on the driveway of our old house in yesterday's shirt. His joint card declined at an ATM I'd closed the night before. I sat in my car across the street and watched him through the windshield, calm in a way that surprised even me. His hair was uncombed for the first time in 5 years I'd known him, and his hands shook the way mine hadn't in the kitchen that Tuesday morning. He crossed the lawn when he saw me, already talking before he reached the car, already demanding I explain, reverse, undo whatever I'd done. I rolled the window down only far enough to be heard clearly. You counted every cent of mine for 3 years, Mark. I counted the days until I was free. The account is closed. I drove away before he could answer, because there was nothing left for him to say that would change anything now. On the kitchen table, where he'd find it later that morning, I'd left a single receipt. $6 and change, the exact price of the strawberries from that day in Whole Foods, printed fresh from a store across town. Beside it sat my wedding ring and nothing else. Freedom was never about the $41,000. It was being the only one who got to approve my own choices, down to the last $6. So tell me, would you have stayed silent for 3 years to build a way out, or would you have walked the very first day? Let me know in the comments, and if this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more.